It wasn't until just recently that fans realized there was an All-American Women's Baseball League. But it shouldn't have been too surprising that the most powerful team in that league was the Fort Wayne Daisies.
In the 1940s, while America was at war and 5 million women were in the workforce, Fort Wayne was honored by the presence of one of the phenomenons of baseball. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League is a story that most of us are much more familiar with now, thanks to the movie A League of Our Own and some of the efforts of the league's players. But the Daisies are synonymous with women's professional baseball. They are, in many ways, heroes of our time to be recognized. They were very, very fine athletes. They've played under very unusual circumstances. They started out with a softball that eventually became a hardball. They started out with underhand pitching that eventually became overhand pitching. It went from being somewhat of a little freaky show to a very, very popular sport. And then in 1954, as the world changed, their game went away.
The Fort Wayne Daisies had 4 of the league's top 10 hitters. They made a very important contribution to baseball sports history. Memorial Park Stadium was the place to be to see great baseball played during World War II, even though the men were off fighting a war.
From 1945 to 1954, Fort Wayne was the host site of one of the phenomenons of baseball. The Fort Wayne Daisies are synonymous with the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. Most of us have heard about women's baseball because of the movie A League of Our Own. But the people who were in Fort Wayne that I've talked to, who would go to Memorial Park Stadium in the evenings to watch the women play baseball, it was a focal point of life in this community. The league began in 1943. The Daisies came to Fort Wayne in 1945. They had some phenomenal ball players over the year. It was not very good women's baseball. It was very good baseball.
In Fort Wayne from 1946 to 1949, 78,000 fans came to see the Daisies at Memorial Park. That was nearly 62% of the population. The Fort Wayne Daisies had a star player named Dottie Collins, who in 1945 won 29 games, lost 10, had an ERA of 0.83 with 17 shutouts. The next year, she struck out 294 women.
In my opinion, Dottie Collins is one of the heroes of our time. She began as a star softball player in Southern California. She pitched before thousands and thousands of people when she was 16 years old. She came east in the 1944 season to play for the Minneapolis Millerettes in the All-American Girls Professional Baseball League. And when that team folded and became the Fort Wayne Daisies, she came here. She had a fastball, and a curve, and an undying competitiveness. She also found a really fantastic guy and married and settled down here, and she's been in our community ever since. It is women like Dottie Collins who say that they never did anything with the feminist movement in mind, and they really didn't. But what they have done is provide us with a role model of how competition and success go together, regardless of what sex you are.
The admission price to a Daisy game? 74 cents. The All-American Girls Professional Baseball League was established in 1943 by Mr. P.K. Wrigley. It started as fast-pitch softball and evolved into hardball. Fort Wayne had the Daisies,
The competition in the league was the greatest that you could find in the whole country. The scouts that Wrigley sent out, who were scouts from his Chicago Cubs, traveled the whole United States. There was great women's softball leagues on the East Coast and on the West Coast, and a lot of them in the Midwest too. But what they did was went to each area and picked out the cream of the crop, the best that they could find, and brought them back into Chicago for tryouts. And a lot of girls were sent home. A lot of girls were sent home that were good ball players, but that's because they didn't follow the rules. Wrigley had set down rules for the league that were ungodly. They wouldn't work in this day and age, that's for sure. We were not allowed to drink. We were not allowed to smoke. We were not allowed to wear slacks at any time. We had to dress like a lady at all times. So it was a tough road for anybody that wanted to play in the league, but if you wanted to play, you followed the rules, and we all wanted to play, that's for sure.
Their uniform featured a skirt, which certainly was no protection when sliding into home. And when the uniform was first unveiled to the women, the response was not surprising.
There was no way they were going to play in that outfit, but we did.
The Fort Wayne Daisies were great women. They put on a great show, and they were great athletes.
I think the greatest player, or the greatest hitter in the league, I never pitched against. I swore I never would, and I didn't. And that was Betty Foss, who played for Fort Wayne, Betty Foss Weaver. And I remember the year she came to spring training. I think it was in Opelika, Florida. And I saw her get up to the plate and hit. She was right from the farm, really a farm girl, her and her two sisters. And I watched her hit a couple balls, and I told the manager, I said, I'll never pitch batting practice to her, and I never did. Because if she ever would hit one back through the box at you, she'd probably kill you. She was so strong and hit the ball so hard. I do believe, as far as hitting is concerned, she's the only woman I know of that could hit men's pitching.
The fans had a love affair with the Fort Wayne Daisies, and they showered them with gifts.
Yeah, if you pitched a no-hitter, you got a dozen roses, or you got a lot of things from fans. I pitched a doubleheader one night and got 2 cases of beer.
There were 2 outstanding sisters that played for the Fort Wayne Daisies, Helen and Margaret Callahan. Helen led the league in hitting at 5'1", 105 pounds.
She was a fantastic little ball player, and she was so graceful. She was just like almost like a ballet dancer out on the field. She's deceased now, and some of you might remember Casey Candale, who played for the Houston Astros. That's her son. And whenever he gets up to bat, it's Helen standing there. He bats exactly like she did. He doesn't hit. The only trouble is he can't hit like she did. But he stands just like she did, and he swings just like she does.
Casey is still in the minors playing AAA ball, and Helen's other son, Kelly, wrote the screenplay for the documentary that became the movie A League of Their Own. The Fort Wayne Daisies had a grueling schedule, playing 126 games during the year, 7 days a week with doubleheaders on Sundays. The women worked very hard at a game they enjoyed. They were pioneers, but they're the first to deny paving the way for the women's liberation movement of the 60s.
We never thought about that. We've always had the question asked of us, were the men managers downgrading to us, you know, and things like that. We never thought of that, did we?
No.
It didn't make any difference to us. I mean, I never had any of the managers treat me bad or anything, but we always get those questions. But you have to remember that we were born in a different era. And the things that young people think about today when it comes to, what do I want to say? Equal rights, yeah, I guess that would be it. We never even thought about it. We were playing baseball, and that's all we wanted to do. and we didn't care what else went on in this world. We were playing and doing what we wanted to do.
Americans have been playing baseball for more than 200 years. They've been playing in streets, sandlots, small parks, anywhere you can imagine where anybody can get a game together, including beautiful baseball stadiums like this. Fort Wayne has been a key player in this country's baseball history.
Well, baseball's been part of the Fort Wayne community since the Civil War. It's been part of the city's proud heritage. Started as a game with gentlemen playing by gentlemen's rules, and then it became town teams with amateurs playing the game, and then it became professional with professional ball clubs, such as the first team in the National Association for Professional Baseball Players. And through the 20th century, it has been also minor league baseball, it's been amateur baseball, it's been the Daisies. It has had names like the Railroaders and the Farmers and the Chiefs and the Hoosiers and the Generals. And the Wizards are just the latest development in that line of history. The Wizards draw over 300,000 people here last year. It was obviously a felt need in this community. And if they average 250,000 people a season, that's very, very good in terms of minor league baseball.
Yes, Fort Wayne and baseball go together like peanuts and Cracker Jacks. Fort Wayne had its share of baseball first, and there was one particular exhibition game that was played years ago that people are still talking about.
One of the really great stories in Fort Wayne baseball history occurs in 1927, and it's not about really organized baseball. It's about a group of Fort Wayne men who for 9 innings play the greatest team ever in the history, even up. It's 1927, and the Lincoln Lifers are a team here in Fort Wayne. They have some fine young ball players, and as the game was in that period, some of the major league teams would stop through and play an exhibition game to bring baseball, Major League Baseball, to the fans in cities where they would not see. So early in the 1927 season, the New York Yankees, perhaps the greatest team ever, with the people like Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, Bob Musial, Tony Lazzeri, Jumpin' Joe Dugan, come to Fort Wayne on the Pennsylvania Railroad at 11:30 in the morning. It's not like it is today, where players fly here, fly there. In the 20s and the 30s and the 40s, players took the train. The Yankees had lost the day before in Washington, and on their way to Chicago, stopped in Fort Wayne. And they took the field against the Lincoln Lifers, as they were called, up at League Park. Now, it wasn't a game where they played a lot of scrubs or a lot of second-ranked ball players. Ruth was there playing first base, out of position, but he could play first base. And Gehrig was in the outfield, and Earl Combs, one of the finest center fielders, was playing center. And they pitched a second-line pitcher named Walter Beal against Lincoln. Lincoln countered with a left-hander named Chuck Noll, who was a very, very fine pitcher in his league. Well, the Yankees weren't about to just sort of give it up and roll over and play dead against this team. Combs, in fact, hit the 3rd pitch of the game out of the ballpark for a home run. And after 3 innings, the Yankees led 2-0. Well, in the top of the 8th, Lincoln started to rally. A double, a walk, a bunt in which Ruth, trying to field, fell down. And suddenly there were runners on all the bases. A force out brings in 1 run, and then a double steal, and another double brings in 2 more runs. The double was by a third baseman named Joe Henry, who I don't believe ever played outside of Fort Wayne. So going to the bottom of the 8th, Lincoln leads 3-2, and the Yankees are not about to roll over and play dead again. And they get the runner on, and sure enough, Gehrig, who's had 3 singles for the day, gets another, and it's tied up. Into the 10th, it's growing dark. There's a train to catch. And finally, Mike Gazzella gets a single, and up comes Ruth. This is the season Ruth hits 60 home runs. He's perhaps the toast of baseball throughout the 20s. The greatest ball player probably ever to live. He takes up time to get up to the plate. There's a crowd of kids swarming around him, according to the newspaper reports. Noel's on the mound. He looks and he throws a curveball, and it's a call strike, and Ruth doesn't like it. He throws his second pitch, and Ruth swings mightily and misses, and he's got them down 0-2, 2 outs, a runner on. Still a tie ball game. But Noel doesn't waste a pitch. He decides to challenge Ruth, and Ruth hits this shot like unbelievable, according to the people who were there. It goes over the right field wall. It goes over Clinton Street, and the Yankees win the ball game. And as Ruth is running around the bases, he says to the people who can hear him, with all these little kids chasing after him, "I told you to pack up the bags. We're ready to go."
They were playing baseball here before the Civil War, believe it or not.
Baseball starts in Fort Wayne, 1862, with the formation of a club, and it's revived after the Civil War. It's a gentleman's game. It's a game where gentlemen play the game according to the rules, and it's very, very fashionable, and it's somewhat elite. The game begins to attract other people, outsiders, and it becomes more of a town game in which Fort Wayne will play some other community, and they will all have a picnic-like affair. Baseball starts to become professionalized in the late 1860s and early 1870s, and the forerunner of the National League is formed in 1871 in New York City. Among the teams paying the $10 admission fee is the Fort Wayne Kiki-Ongas. How does Fort Wayne get to be one of the teams with Chicago and Washington and Boston and Troy, New York, some of the major powers? Well, a few years before, the Baltimore Club, which was a touring professional baseball club, had some money problems and disbanded in Fort Wayne. And one of the central figures was a gentleman named Bobby Matthews. Historically, it's said that Bobby Matthews developed the curveball, and that he learned how to snap his wrist to make the ball seem to curve. Whether that's true or not, Bobby Matthews formed the nucleus for the Kiki-Ongas.
Fort Wayne was the site of the first National Association of Professional Baseball League games in America on May 4th, 1871, when the Fort Wayne Kiki-Ongas beat the Cleveland Forest Cities 2-0. Black players were barred from the major leagues before 1947. However, that didn't keep African Americans out of the game, and it didn't keep them from making an impact on baseball's history, even here in Fort Wayne.
Most of us who grew up after the Second World War think that Jackie Robinson was the first African American to play baseball in the major leagues. But there were ball players, black ball players in the late 19th century who played equally and had opportunities in places like Fort Wayne and Toledo and Indianapolis before the Jim Crow barriers went up. One of them was a man named Solomon White. And Solomon White was a very articulate man. He came from Ohio. He was a manager and a ball player, and he actually played his last competitive games here in Fort Wayne in 1895. In that time, he was 28 years old, and he hit .385. The phenomenon of a black man playing with white men should not be lost on us. It was a rarity, but there was an acceptance. But Solomon White's greatest contribution is probably his book on the history of colored baseball. It was a very small book, about 5 inches by about 3 inches, and about 128 pages. It had photos and advertisements. But what it did was capture for history an era of black baseball players that we would not have now, that era between 1890 and 1905. He was also able to show us in history what it was like to play ball in that era. For instance, an average baseball player in 1905, a white baseball player, would make $2,000 a year, and the average black ball player would be making about $440 a year. It was that kind of detail that White was able to capture and provide us a better understanding of what it was like to be in America and being a black American at the turn of the century.
This is Memorial Stadium, home of the Fort Wayne Wizards. It's a beautiful park built in 1993 by the community for their new Midwest League Class A team. In the late 1880s, Fort Wayne had another ballpark.
One of the great fields in our history was something called League Park. It was down off of Clinton Street, east of Calhoun. I guess what was called the Jail Flats at the time. It was built in 1884, rebuilt a few years later. It was flooded as anything must be down there in the early part of the century. But it is where the Chiefs played, and Babe Ruth played, and John McGraw brought the Giants, and Connie Mack brought the A's to play teams from Fort Wayne. It must have been a hitter's park too, because in some of the years the statistics for the ball players were phenomenal. People hitting 152 runs batted in. But there's also sort of a little mystery about League Park. 1930, the Fort Wayne Chiefs were in the Central League, and they were having a pretty fine year. In July, after a ball game, League Park burned to the ground. The photographs that you can see in the Firehouse Museum shows the smoldering embers of this wonderful grandstand and people sort of dazedly standing around. Well, the pundits at the time said that somebody was angry about being thrown out of the ballpark and set fire. Some other folks said that smoldering ash and the sawdust that they spread underneath the stands to absorb up all the food and whatever started the blaze. Whatever it was the beginning of the end of minor league baseball in that era in Fort Wayne, as they had to find a new home. They rebuilt League Park, but by 1934 and 1935, Fort Wayne has come to the end of its road in that period of minor league baseball.
Baseballs rarely fly across Clinton Street anymore, but they do fly across Coliseum Boulevard. A lot of interesting men have beaten the odds to play great baseball, and Fort Wayne had its share of gifted players. Take George Kim.
It's not unusual to have deaf mutes playing sports, but George Kim was exceptional. He played until he was 38 years old, and he played in Fort Wayne as the first baseman from 1897 to 1898. And he was not just a so-so first baseman. He led the leagues in home runs with 17.
George is proof that baseball is more than a game. It's hope, pure and simple. And that hope accomplishes amazing things. Fort Wayne's baseball history includes the name of a man, Sylvester Simon, who accomplished some incredible feats despite a severe handicap.
He played in the 19-teens and 1920s. He had actually played for the St. Louis Browns for about 23 games in 1923 and 1924. He was a good third baseman, a good minor league hitter. But after the 1926 season, he cut a large part of his hand off in an accident in a factory. I've seen pictures of it, and all that's left is one finger and a little bit of skin here and the heel of his hand. But Sylvester Simon was not letting that stand in the way of baseball. He basically built himself a mechanical device that fit around this part of his hand, and then he covered it with a glove so that he could hold a baseball bat and swing it. It didn't bother him too much to field, but he could swing the bat. With his specially designed glove and the mechanical grip, he was able to come back in 1928 for the Fort Wayne Chiefs and hit .360, and 2 years later he hit .364 with the same Chiefs in the Central League.
Sylvester Simon's determination to overcome his handicap was fueled by a love of the game. Fort Wayne had baseball teams on or off from about 1900 through 1935. By today's standards, baseball was much different.
The ball players in the earlier period were more experienced, usually, and the ball players that you see now are very young. They're starting out their professional careers. It was unusual, but it did happen, that players could go from the Central League, the Class B league where the Fort Wayne Chiefs played, right to the majors in a single season. More often than not, they went higher up in the chain to bigger minor league clubs and then on to the majors. For the Wizards, it's a longer road. If the ball players prove themselves here, then they can go on to AA and then AAA, and in this case, hopefully, the Minnesota Twins. But the odds are still the same. Very few ball players that you see on a field in a given game will ever make the majors.
But that's the fun of watching the Wizards. You never know when another Ty Cobb might show up. There is a Fort Wayne baseball fact that's been stretched a little bit, but when the truth is out, it's still pretty interesting.
Where was the first night baseball game played? Well, if you're from Fort Wayne, you probably have thought for most of this century that it was right here. That on June 3rd, 1883, the Quincy, Illinois professional team played the Fort Wayne Methodist College team and beat them 19-11. Well, history doesn't substantiate that. The first real night game was 2 years before, and it was in similar circumstances under a similar community with temporary lighting. What is interesting about the Fort Wayne game, though, is that it involved a professional team, and it involved a lighting system developed here in Fort Wayne. It was 17 Jenny arc lamps used to illuminate the field, not very well from what we have read, and allowing the teams sometimes to disappear into darkness when the Jenny lamps failed. But it basically forecast the coming of night baseball. The experiment in Fort Wayne and other communities showed that it was possible. And in the 30s, when the Depression hit and minor league baseball suffered, as every industry suffered, it was night baseball, especially on the West Coast, that enabled baseball to survive and to prosper.
So we weren't the site of the first night baseball game, but we were one of the first of the places to give it a shot. How well the fans could actually see the game, that's another question. When you think about baseball in Fort Wayne, many names come to mind, and they aren't all players.
Fort Wayne is connected to some very interesting events in history of baseball through one man. These events include baseball in World War II, Jackie Robinson, a rival into baseball in the major leagues in 1947, and Roger Maris hitting his 61st home run in 1961 for the New York Yankees. Who was that man? It was Ford Frick. He was president of the National League from 1934 to 1951 and commissioner of baseball from 1951 to 1963. Frick was a man who started his career as a newspaperman. He was a graduate of DePaul University and a strong believer in individual rights. It was Frick who told the President Roosevelt in 1942 that it was his command. Whatever the president wanted, baseball would do. It was Frick who in 1947 heard that the St. Louis Cardinals were thinking of striking rather than take the field with a black man, who said that if anybody did that, he would suspend them forever, and he didn't care how long it would damage the National League, that every American had the right to play baseball. And it was Ford Frick, friend of Babe Ruth in his youth, who basically put the little asterisk next to Roger Maris's name for 61 home runs in the 1961 season, because Maris played more games than Ruth did. But what's Ford Frick's connection to Fort Wayne? Ford Frick started here as a sports writer on the Journal-Gazette in 1910.
Several players from Fort Wayne have gone to the big leagues. Two brothers by the name of Bubbles and Pinky Hargrave made quite a name for themselves.
Bubbles played from 1913 to 1930 with a variety of teams, the Cubs and the Reds mostly, and finished his career with the Yankees. And his brother Pinky, who was 2 years younger, played mostly in the American League with the Senators and the Tigers and the A's and other teams. What's interesting about Bubbles is that in 1926, he wins the National League batting crown. What's so unusual about winning a batting crown? Well, Hargrave is one of only 2 catchers ever to win a batting title.
Bubbles was considered, quote, an exceptional hitter for a catcher. Bill Wambsgans made an incredible impact on Fort Wayne baseball. Originally from Ohio, the second baseman's father was a pastor at Trinity English Lutheran Church.
Wambsgans played most of his career for the Indians, and he is the man who made the first and only unassisted triple play in the 1920 World Series against the Brooklyn Dodgers. Wambsgans finished his career and then came back and managed the Fort Wayne minor league team, the Chiefs, and he also managed the Fort Wayne Daisies. He was known as Wamby. He was known as Wams. He was a fine infielder, a good hitter, and also a real presence in Fort Wayne baseball.
During his career with the Cleveland Indians, he led the American League in putouts and assists by a second baseman in 1924 and double plays in 1917. Since Fort Wayne is rarely mentioned when we're discussing baseball, you might think maybe we didn't have very many winning teams, but quite to the contrary.
Since 1888, there have been 32 different teams here in Fort Wayne in organized baseball. Now, organized baseball meaning the minor leagues. Half a dozen of them were losing. It's a pretty phenomenal record. 26 teams with winning records. They won the league championship 3 times, and they won 1 playoff, and they lost twice. Fort Wayne has a winning performance record when it comes to organized baseball.
In 1950, Fort Wayne had a short-lived professional baseball team called the Capehart Capes. They won the World Semi-Professional Baseball Championship in Tokyo that year. Another team you rarely hear about, but one that deserves note, is the fastball Zollner Pistons softball team started by Fred Zollner. From the early 1940s to the mid-50s, the Zollner Pistons won no less than 3 World Softball Association championships. The ball was pitched at an amazing 102 miles per hour. There are 9 Zollner Piston players in the Softball Hall of Fame. They include Leo Lucan, Bernie Kamschmidt, Huey Johnston, Jim Ramage, Sam Lombardo, Elmer Roars, Bill West, Clyde Dizzy Kirkendall, and Fred Zollner. It's said they once had a winning streak of 53 straight games.